You're listening to Healing Voices Project, where we share stories and the latest information from people who fight addiction every day. I'm Mike Torville, your host and author of Voices from the Fallen. Thank you for listening, for following, and most of all, for sharing with people you care about. Make your voice count too. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us back here on Healing Voices Project. We're glad to have you, and we are glad to have our guest today. He's a gentleman I've spoken with on the phone. His name is Vernon Baumrind, and Vernon wrote a book about an experience. The book is called Deceit, and you can find that on his website called deceitthebook.com. It's also available on Amazon and other outlets, and we'll get into that. But this book, I read it about a month ago, and very interesting, and it hits on so many topics that I think this was really worth talking about. We're going to talk about trauma. We're going to talk about mental health. We're going to talk about sex addiction and all these things that affect not just the person going through it, but the entire family and the extent of that, and how this all um, affects so many people more than just the one person going through it. So Vernon, thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me.
Sure, sure. It's been a pleasure,
Appreciate
and it was
the
a pleasure
opportunity.
talking to you last week. Um, as I mentioned, I read your book, and it was very good, very well written. It kept me going. It was like watching a movie unfold, and I wanted to know what in the world is going to come out of this mess. And that was a traumatizing event.
It was indeed, and you sort of stole a little bit of my thunder because I was going to tell you initially that as I reviewed the outline of your podcast, I was struck particularly with how well my story aligns with your program, wherein you generally are discussing trauma, addictions, specifically sex addiction, ego manipulation, mental health, recovery, grief, and other related topics. But yeah, this is a story that includes all of these topics and many more
Yeah.
of love, intimate betrayal, sex addiction, and a battle for custody. All in this instance that were captured by wiretap.
Well, and that puts another twist on these things, because not only did you capture it on wiretap and you um, applied this technology, and by the way, this event occurred in the late 70s, which is about 45 years ago, um, prior to the extent of the wiretapping devices and technology we have now. And so I say I wouldn't maybe call it ingenious, but I guess it was creative for you to be able to figure out exactly how to know for sure what was happening. And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but again, I'll mention the book is called Deceit, and it's about things that we're going to talk about that occurred 45 years ago. So I'm going to ask you first to walk us through the story a little bit about what happened so people have a context. But then the other follow-up question to keep in mind, which is always probably you've been asked 1,000 times, this event occurred 45 years ago, Vernon, and yet you decided at the to write it 45 years later. And when did the book come out, by the way?
Came out in June last year, so a year ago.
So, and I'm not, but you're at the time you wrote your book, you're 78 years old.
That's
Is that
correct.
correct? And,
That's correct.
well, that's quite an undertaking. Having written a couple books myself, it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy. Um, and so I commend you for that. But a lot of people wouldn't take on that endeavor at 78 years old, but something compelled you to do that. Um, so I'm going to reverse this a little bit, but I will ask you, why did you wait all this time to write this book?
Um, well, you would almost have to understand some of the story to understand why I waited this long. There were
Okay.
two small children at the time. The story took place originally in late 1978, 1979, and extended into the early 1980s.
Yeah.
Um, and I had two young children. They were only 4 and 2 years of age at the time. And the content of the wiretap was so salacious. The conversations that took place between
Mm-hmm.
my wife, unfortunately, and her doctor, her gynecologist, their conversations were so salacious in detail that um, it would have been detrimental to the young children, um,
Understood.
this to
Yeah.
be published.
Yeah.
There was, but basically, what happened is, well, it's a story of a loving father facing formidable legal odds to secure custody of his two small children, using wiretap technology that's not possible today because cell phones can't be tapped. And so
Yeah.
this was prior to uh, cell phones coming into vogue.
Yeah.
This father is able to turn the tide in his favor in the case of a cheating wife and a manipulative um, uh, morally
Doctor.
corrupt gynecologist
Yeah.
who was a lifelong sexual predator with power and authority, whose vile exploits um, have devastating effects on everyone in his sphere.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but
Well,
to get back to answering your question about the 45-year period, yes, this story needed to be told earlier, and because undoubtedly the elements of this chronicle have been repeated countless times since the story occurred, and
mm-hmm.
it's even occurring it's in progress again today somewhere else by
Wow.
others like the doctor in this story to some unsuspecting family,
Yeah.
and some devastating results are in wait.
So
So the
yours,
detail, excuse me, go
your
ahead.
family isn't the only one that's been affected by this person's
Mhm.
activity or behavior.
That's correct.
Um,
Right.
Now I jumped ahead because it's sort of like we set up a teaser, kind of like we just saw the movie trailer, and now we'll get into what can you and because we did a little backwards, but let's walk through the sequence of what happened and how things developed, and then we'll get into some discussion and questions about because I've got a lot of questions about your self-control, your restraint, and how you were able to handle all of this with two young children. But let's get back into the story and walk us through the events that occurred in the
Sure.
late 70s.
Um, while in its simplest form, it's a story of marital infidelity, a not so unusual occurrence in life. Um, but it's more than just that. It's a story it's never been told before, and one that cannot ever occur again because of the wiretap. It's believed that these events are the only time in history that every word of the plot of the story was captured by wiretap. Um, and this wiretap was ruled to have been legal at the time. But I might add, later, uh, the litigations that ensued were reversed. And so the wiretap became illegal. And that happened very quickly. That happened only in an 18-month span from the time the wiretap was ruled in my favor to have been legal. It was reversed. And there was a reason for that. The case began to be picked up all over the country by other attorneys, and they were using it as a justification for wiretapping. And they were
Yeah,
doing
but there's with in all this wiretapping thing that went on, and I saw you sort of set a legal precedent here that got changed. But what prompted you to do the wiretapping in the first place?
well, I realized that I had lost my wife, and only the children were left. And I had to control my emotions, contain my impulses, my worst
Meaning
impulses.
you lost her emotionally. She was detached. That's what you mean?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. Yeah. Mm.
Um, and I had to gather evidence of what was going on. I knew I wanted to fight for custody of my children. I was the better parent. I knew I was the more stable parent. And in fact, she and I had conversations. By the way, he and his family moved into our neighborhood um, shortly after our youngest child, after he delivered our youngest child. They moved into the neighborhood with neighbors. So we got to know them as friends. And we knew him as a derelict father. His children were down at our house all the time, starved for attention. So I knew that he was a poor example for a father, and I was the better of the two of us, in my opinion. And the
Mm.
court, of course, agreed with me later on. Um, so that's what prompted me to. It made it necessary for me to find out what it was that they were talking about. And I knew that I could not have them learn that I knew what was going on, because then they would take measures to defend themselves. So I had to keep silent about what was occurring, and I had to gather the evidence. And one of the first thing that came to my mind was I need to know what they're saying to one another, because I remembered on many occasions I would come home and she would be quickly hanging up the telephone.
Hmm.
So all the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. And so the logical thing was to, at that time, we only had a landline phone, no cell phones.
Right.
Uh, so I tapped that telephone. And from that point on, every time the telephone came off the receiver, it was recording the conversations.
And by the way, this tapping device that you bought, you were able to just buy it at a computer store, and install it yourself
There
very
was an
easily.
electronic store in the town that we lived in, and I
Hmm.
went there and told them I needed to record business telephone conversations. I didn't know the ramifications of wiretapping at the time, and I didn't know whether they would sell me a device like this. And he said, "Yeah, I'll show you something that'll work," and it did very well.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Wow. So you had these conversations that you were able to listen to almost in real time, because right afterwards you had a room where you were able to listen to the conversations that revealed they were having this affair.
That's correct.
Yeah. And yet you had to continue on with your day-to-day activities in life as if everything was normal after hearing some salacious details.
That's correct.
How did you handle that?
Um, it was the most trying and calamitous storm of my life, and my response to a raging event that challenged and impacted every faculty and fiber of my being. Really, uh, it was very difficult, but the children were first in my mind, and they gave me
Hmm.
the strength to do what I had to do.
And your children were both about 4 and 2 years old at the time?
They were 4 and 2 years of age, right?
Hmm.
A son and a daughter.
And they obviously were unaware of what was happening, and you had to kind of go about life. And it was Christmas time. I remember in the book, it was Christmas time, so you had all those Christmas things you had to do in the tree as a family. Yet inside, you had a little storm raging in your mind while you're
That's
on the
correct.
outside trying to be normal.
That's
Um,
correct.
that's got to be an emotional drain. And then continue to hear. Now, after a month or so of recording these conversations, there's a time when you said, okay, now what? Now what do I do? What came next?
Um, well, it wasn't necessarily a month later. It was almost immediately, or within
Okay.
24 hours after I tapped the telephone. and I heard the first telephone conversation between the two of them, I knew I needed to document this even further. And so I hired a detective who was able to, I was able to coordinate with, and he was able to document everything that was occurring. The times they were meeting together. And then, of course, I asked him about a reference for an attorney, a good attorney. And he recommended,
Okay.
there was only one person in his mind
Hmm.
who just happened to be the top domestic attorney in the state, probably in both
Hmm.
Carolinas. Fortunately, I was able to get together with him, and we were able to see the situation all the way through together.
Yeah. Yeah. And then once this was revealed, once your call it secret because it's not really once your this was all revealed, um, your wife you separated. Does it? How did you? And then you separated, and then went through the divorce process.
Yes, well, we didn't separate for about a month
Hmm.
after the revelation came to me, what was occurring. We continued to live together in the same house. That was one of the things that um, made the wiretap, um, made the court system declare the wiretap to be legal, was the fact that we were still living together within the same home. It was on wires within the confines of my home. The telephone was in my name. It was my only means of defense. In fact, the doctor was not entitled to any privacy within the confines of my home. And so the lower courts and then the federal Supreme Court ruled in my favor. So I was basically vindicated.
Okay. You're right. And at the time, because it was occurred in your house, the taping, if you had recorded in his house, it would have been illegal, but you did
Oh,
it in the
yes.
confines of your own
Or,
property. So that
or
was the
even if
difference.
we had been estranged and living apart and I had snuck back into the house and installed a wiretap, that would have been illegal.
Okay.
So
Uh,
the specific circumstances of my case, they couldn't rule against me.
yeah. Yep. So as you go through the separation and the courts and the divorce, all that ensued, and as this gets revealed to not just your children who were not aware because they were only 4 and 2 years old, but it had to have had an effect on your other family. You had brothers or sisters and friends and coworkers and people who said, "Whoa, wow, what happened here, Vernon?" Um, this that's a difficult thing to go through as well.
It is a difficult thing, but I found that people generally gave me my privacy. I rarely had anybody saying anything to me. I wasn't talking about it. Only my parents knew. My parents lived within 20 miles. They were sort of helpful to me initially. And then, of course, I had a younger sister also who
Hmm.
had a child. And so I had a support uh,
Hmm.
team around me. I had plenty of support initially. But I didn't find that I had to, explain myself or answer any questions. That wasn't happening.
Yeah, because I can imagine if it came out today, a lot of people say, "Wow, you did what? You recorded?" It,
Oh,
it's it's a whole different thing now. Yeah.
well, for 3 or 4 months after I had done that and gathered all this evidence, when we were already in the process um, of getting through the divorce and the custody hearing, all of that only took 100 days. In the state of South Carolina, you can get a divorce within 90 days on grounds
Wow.
of adultery.
Hmm.
So I, I think my divorce was finalized within like 103, 104 days.
Hmm.
Uh, but we did not know whether the wiretap was legal or not. So I was not to discuss it whatsoever. My attorney forewarned me not to talk about the wiretap, and I didn't because we didn't
Hmm.
know I was going to be found guilty of wiretapping, and there'd be a federal indictment imposed. And so I kept mum about the wiretap.
You did until all things transpired, but shortly after this event, you caught some media attention. Wasn't it discussed on a couple of national TV shows at the time,
um,
wasn't it?
yes. Once, yeah, in a deposition with the doctor, um, they kept trying to learn what kind of evidence I had to support my claims. And when you're in a deposition and you're asked what evidence do you have, um, you got to be honest about it.
Yeah.
And in just a few days before we had that deposition, my attorney actually secured an opinion from a legal research group that researches topics like this and tries to give attorneys advance information about the legalities of maybe situations that they're pursuing. And in this case, we got an opinion from the Legal Research Institute, where they were of the opinion that they basically came up with the same opinion that the lower court did on
Hmm.
Wires' own home, living together. The doctor's not entitled to privacy within the confines of his home. It was his only means of defense. So they suggested that they thought I would be vindicated, which is exactly what happened. So I was able to reveal to the opposing attorney that I had a wiretap. Initially, he asked me, "Do you have pictures?" They were asking, "What kind of evidence do you have?" Um, I don't have pictures, but I've employed detectives. They've got the pictures.
Hmm.
What else? What other evidence do you have? Well, I wiretapped our telephone. Oh, you wiretapped your telephone illegally, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Natural, right? Yeah, yeah. Wow. Wow. And I think when you started listening, and one of the things that I was amazed at throughout reading the book and speaking with you after is the self-control and restraint you had exercised here, because a lot of people would have reacted impulsively and thereby ruining the opportunity to have this work in your favor.
That's correct. But
Hmm.
um, I knew remaining silent was my only shot at getting custody of the children. Men don't typically back then. Men didn't typically get custody of their children,
Right.
especially in the state that we were in. And my attorney told me that. He said, this is a very long shot. You're getting custody of the children. Um, but even before that conversation with him, I knew that just merely being the mother, that I was going to lose these children, and I couldn't have that happen. I already knew too much about him, and I felt too strongly about myself being the better parent, and so I didn't have any choice to protect the children. I had to control my emotions. I had to contain my impulses, and I had the same impulses that any human being would have in a situation like this, from self pity to wanting to be confrontational, wanting to be violent, resort to violence. I
Hmm.
felt I wanted to kill him.
Right. Yeah.
Ah, and I had that opportunity a couple of times, but the children were too important. They were more important.
Yeah, and it's great you realize it. And again, we're hitting the surface of things here, and the uh certainly the motivation to want to react the way you described is in the book. And once you read the book, which I recommend to anybody listening, you'll understand what would motivate somebody to violence, because that's why I said, "Oh my God, how did you hold back?" Um, it's good that you did, because you may have turned out to be the one in jail and without the children. So obviously that turned out to be the better
Correct.
choice without question. Now, I want to go back into this because we talked about the events and all that, but what you learned after, and whether it was with your wife or this doctor who was the gynecologist, um, what you started to learn is about the addictive nature of sex and how the compulsion, it seems to be as powerful as drugs sometimes. And it seemed to be in this case that despite consequences, despite all that was going on, the the sex and the sexual uh, predator behavior did not stop despite all of this.
That's correct. It got worse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It and
Uh,
you would think anyone would say, "Well, stop, look what's happening." But it still gets worse despite those consequences, and you saw firsthand what the sex addiction, um, could lead to, and you had to have scratched your head and say, "Is this normal?" Uh, for them to continue, with this with all this activity and behavior despite all that was going on. In the midst of your separation and her trying to get the custody battles, this continued with them as well, correct?
that's correct.
Hmm. And a little bit about what you learned after the fact also is about this particular doctor. Again, the name is in the book. You're not mentioning the name here, but uh, what you learned afterwards is there were several women, several coworkers, and others that were subjected to his behavior,
That's
right?
correct. That's correct. And really, this was the reason after all these years I decided to write this book was because of the behavior of this doctor. Because there are people to this day who follow the same path that he
Mhm.
did. So it's important to see how this particular individual, how this unscrupulous professional operated, and to understand how the tragedy that resulted from his conduct was possible. He was controlling, domineering, manipulative. He had an attitude of entitlement. You know, the most powerful element at play was his overpowering influence, which he used to advantage himself. He had a compulsion,
Repeatedly, yeah.
right? He had a compulsion for pornography and a corresponding addiction to sex, stemming from his obsession with pornography, and as indicated, he was a lifelong sexual predator. It is revealed by, as you indicated, is revealed by patients and former employees. He used this power to leverage himself um, with females for purposes having nothing to do with the reasons a woman typically visits her gynecologist. He preyed on unsuspecting and vulnerable women, exploiting his status as a doctor in highly unethical fashion. All this was corroborated by witness testimony and the medical board ethics conclusions publicized in court, all corroborated by witness testimony and the medical board ethics conclusions. Um, I think, as you indicated, with all this was, covered all over the country in the newspapers. And actually, 2020, ABC's 2020 program did a story on this in 1985. It was moderated by Barbara Walters and Hugh Downs.
Mhm.
Of course, that was in 1985, and that generated a lot of interest in women. I began to get telephone calls from former patients of his and employees who were basically corroborating everything that they were hearing and telling me that he needed to have his license removed. And so we all got together. They were not uh, individuals were not willing to take the action themselves, but collectively they were.
Mhm.
And I ended up filing the complaint with their support. And, we all testified before the medical board and they suspended his license.
So honestly, if it wasn't for the exposure of your story, some of these women may never have come forward. You opened up the
That's,
door, opened up enabling them to feel secure about coming forward, correct?
That's correct. And ultimately, this story exposes the behavior and its consequences, and it emphasizes the importance of recognizing this kind of behavior, this kind of bad conduct, and and having the fortitude to stand up to it, to resist it.
And talk about it and let people know about it and not hide because people may feel ashamed or feel victimized and embarrassed by it or the stigma of it. And especially that's 40 years ago. And so now it's changing a
Uh,
little bit. Um,
right.
but and I guess, believe me, I perfectly understand when your children are young and you don't want to write the book and earlier on because of the effect it may have had. But on the other hand, um, had you written the book earlier, it might have preempted some of those incidences with this doctor, correct?
That is correct. Um, yeah, the story raises the awareness that these things can happen. They
Hmm.
do happen and will continue to happen to others when people like this doctor have a pathway into your life. In this story, it was my wife, by her complicity, who provided this pathway. She was complicit in every way and as guilty as he was. But basically, gaining the awareness, this is what I ultimately realized, that making people aware, giving them the vision of the possibility of this series of events happening to in their lives, it could be the most beneficial, could be the most important benefit to be derived from the account.
And I agree with you in so many ways because we have a lot of people on our program who share their stories, and it's not certainly for entertainment purposes, but it often those stories become relatable, and somebody who might say, "Hey, you know what? I experienced that. I felt that, and maybe I should talk about it, or maybe I should tell somebody." And you hope that opens up the door for somebody to say, "Hey, you know what? Raise my hand and tell and talk with somebody." In the same way, I think your book in this discussion as well, will do that. And the funny thing is, back then, I think sex addiction wasn't talked about that much, and 45 years ago, as much as it is now, and how powerful that can be. And we often talk about addiction, whether it's drugs, alcohol, gambling, and it's when you continue with that behavior despite the consequences, and that addictive behavior just doesn't stop. In this case, it was the same thing. Despite the idea of losing children, despite all the legal consequences, your wife and this doctor did not stop.
That's correct.
Um, now, did they ever? This is framed. Did they ever stop? Did they ever stop?
Well, no, they continued to cohabitate throughout, and
Did they ever get
eventually
married?
they married. Yeah, about
They
2 years.
did.
Yeah, they married about 2 years after our divorce. They did marry.
Are both of them still around
They are
and married still?
they are still married. Um, Unhappily, I understand.
Okay. And again, I don't want to, but after all this was real, didn't he lose his medical license?
He did,
Yeah.
but at the time, you know, at the time, this was in the mid 1980s. A doctor could lose his license in one state and move to the next, and that's what he was able to do. He was able to move from one state to the next. He lost his hospital privileges in the town that we were living in, and his license was suspended. But he was able to. He moved 7 or 8 times over the ensuing years.
Hmm. Hmm. Sort of just jumping ahead and trying to find places to practice. And that ran out. Uh, uh, you
Um,
know, um, there's a lot more opportunities for therapy for different types of addictions, and certainly more for sex addiction therapy now than there was before, certainly talked about more than it was before. I was talking to my uncle George and my aunt Marilyn both run a Celebrate Recovery program. And they talk about, not just drug or alcohol addiction, but gambling and also sex addiction. And then Celebrate Recovery has a great program to help people through all kinds of different issues. But what he said to me the other day was really quite amazing. He says, drugs, alcohol, certainly that's a lot, but he says most of the people, the majority, um, have issues with sex addiction and pornography. And was really quite surprised at that. And I, I just didn't think, but it's certainly it's coming out more than it was. It was sort of hidden before, but it's coming out more and more. And he says that's more predominant than it ever was before. And you mentioned pornography too, because you had learned too that this doctor um, was into pornography quite a bit, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, and so
Was introducing it to her as well.
okay. Um, and so, yeah, and you go if, and I understand completely. Like I said, if you had written this book and maybe others would have come forward, but your reasons to not write it at the time were valid, and I would have probably done the same thing. Young children, you went through enough. You didn't want to have that. But when they got older, at some point they understood, and now they're obviously well aware. It's all public and out in the book. Certainly they understand what's occurred and they're mature enough. And by the way, your children are in their 40s now.
That's
Um,
correct. And they have children themselves.
so how many grandchildren do you have?
I have four. My son has two boys, and my daughter has two girls.
Wow. So they've grown up, they live great lives. You all have a
They,
great relationship. Yeah.
yes, we sure do.
Yeah. See, that's great. Now, are there events or things that force you and your ex-wife and this doctor to see each other, or do you have any occasion to see each other at all?
We have, and I
It's
would
gotta be
say
tough.
in the first 20 years, there was no conversation between us. We just kind of, um, for the sake of the children, for the sake of not
Right.
creating any conflict, we just kind of coexisted when we found ourselves in the company of one another. And probably 15, 20 years ago, I decided, it was always a little stressful, quite stressful. Although no one would say anything that was out of order.
Hmm.
Um, there was still stress there because we weren't speaking to one another, and yet we'd be having be a Thanksgiving meal together. So,
Wow.
and that went on for about 20 years. There's no conversation between us, and then I finally decided, you know what? I think I'm beyond this at this point. I'm going to be more accepting. And they arrived one Thanksgiving, and I went to the front door and invited them in. This was at my son's home, and I offered him my hand, which would have been very difficult to have done prior to my coming to the conclusion that this all needs to end.
Yeah.
This was this was bad enough during the lifetimes of my children while they were growing up, and it doesn't need to continue into another generation. So I welcomed them in, and it was amazing how it just opened up things. And he came over and asked me how I was doing, and said, "I understand you've done this and you've done that. I actually patented a machine. I invented a machine," and he knew all about it.
Uh-huh.
uh, and was asking me questions about it. And then so for the last, I'd say, 20 years, every time we've gotten together, we've been cordial, not overly so, but cordial.
Hmm.
Uh, um, but this book could change things.
Well, that was my next question.
Uh, yeah,
Yeah.
we're a year into this, and as far as I know, they are totally unaware of it. I'm sure if they became aware of it, I'm sure I would know. Something would be said to my adult children, and it would get back to me. But I've not. There's no evidence whatsoever that they're even aware of it.
Yeah, and you're right. When they are aware of it, which they may be, that will change your relationship.
That's going to change things. But you know what? At this point, that's fine. Um, Everybody's grown up, including my grandchildren. At this point, they're
Mhm.
very mature, young adults. They know generally what happened, and we're real
Yeah,
close. There's not going to be an issue
yeah.
uh, on my side of the equation. I'm sure there
Well, I
will be.
certainly, yeah. Now, what I haven't asked you, Vernon, and I guess because we talked about your wife and this doctor, did you ever remarry?
I did not.
No?
Um, just didn't happen.
Hmm.
Had some
Well, you did a
relationship,
beautiful
but
job raising your children, right?
well, I was absorbed in raising the children. Yeah, I
Yeah.
immersed myself in all of the activities that were necessary to keep their lives as normal as possible, and
Hmm.
um, I didn't allow uh, myself to stray from the objective that I had, and I was charged with a huge responsibility of raising these two, and that was always utmost in my mind.
Yeah. Well, I commend you for that because it's it's a lot to be a single parent. And now that they're in their 40s, my children, my two boys are 43 and 40. And so that a little younger, but still, I
Right.
understand it's tough. Um, and believe me, and I commend you for all of this. And you know what? To write this all out, to relive it, and I'm sure it brought out a lot of emotions when you wrote this book that probably came back and affected you, didn't it?
um, it did. It wasn't easy to write, um, but I knew how important it was. It
Hmm.
should have been done earlier. Let's do it now, and let this be helpful to other people. This book is chock full of life's lessons. I wrote them all down. I'm not putting they're in the book. I thought
Yes.
about putting them in an epilogue, and I wrote them all. It's like 50 lessons, and they're all really very interesting. They're important. They're impactful, and they're all in this book, buried in the book. But
Hmm.
I decided just to leave them there in this book.
Yeah, and the book really does have a lot of that and so many levels, Vernon. And this is why I say I enjoyed reading it because it's an easy read. It's well written, and I was thinking, wow, there's more to this than just infidelity. There's more to this than even just the choices you had to make, the restraint you had to show, the nature of addiction to sex and pornography, and where that led. And despite that, what struck me is again, I mentioned it is despite all those negative consequences that continued with the people who were addicted to the pornography and the sex. Um, and there's so many, like you said, layers and lessons in this book that we could just cover in a half hour talking about it superficially. So I recommend, if you haven't, to find the book. It's called Deceit, and it's on the website is deceitthebook.com. Anyway, you look like you were going to say something, and I kept rambling on.
I was only going to add the fact that the addiction was so powerful. It was overwhelming. Um, they neither antagonist could help themselves, including my wife. The things that you would think would be more important to you than anything else, like your children, are not even as important as the addiction.
You just said a lot right there. This is often the case with alcohol or drugs, when that substance or that behavior becomes more important than other things that like your children, your family, and everything else, then and and just continue despite that. Um, and look what's changed. I mean, she gave up the opportunity to have a normal relationship with her children for what turned out to be a sex addiction. And that's just not
Yeah,
temporarily. That was a lifelong thing, right?
exactly. Yeah, children are not temporary; they're permanent. But these two people behaved as though, you know, and this included his own children. And there is more to this story, and it's also in the book. But he had two children just like we did, and his oldest child, the son, because he was so neglected and so embarrassed by all the bad publicity, and so neglected by his father that at the age of, I think it was 22 or 23, he committed suicide.
Oh, oh my.
You
Oh,
know,
wow. Oh, that's horrible. Um, well, see, that goes much deeper than I even thought it would, and that's just horrible. And you know, and this is why I think when you said earlier, yeah, maybe the book could have been written earlier. He had good reasons to wait, but at the same time, the more this can be exposed or talked about, then maybe relationships and lives could be saved because it could maybe help somebody get the therapy they need or talk
right.
through it early on. Um, wow, wow.
Well, there
Well,
was,
yeah.
I'm sorry, there
Go
was,
ahead.
okay, there was another uh, item, another issue that caused my hesitancy in writing the story also, and that is um, there was the possibility from the beginning and throughout all of the interim, that by disseminating the content of the wiretap, I could be vulnerable to liability.
Oh,
That that was always a possibility. So that was always also in my mind. Um, do I do a good deed for humanity by revealing the contents of the story and all that can be learned from it? Or do I shy away from that because I could end up with a federal indictment against me?
oh boy.
And I made the decision, and I could be subject to to some issues here, but at 80, I think I think the power of this story, if this were to come out in a court of law, I think I think I'd have a lot more sympathy than he would be given, or the government would be given in taking an action against me for disseminating the content of this wiretap.
Well, and you're right. By now, I think whatever might have happened would have already occurred. By now, you'd say it hasn't happened, so I'm clear, you would think. But is there still a possibility that some of this may um, come back at you?
You know, I don't know. It's a possibility, but I do realize that who is really going to care? Is the government going to want to spend a lot of money pursuing me in an issue that's moot today?
It, yeah. And like you say, when you get older, and I'm not quite there, but getting there. There's an
I'm
age where you say, "Who cares?"
I've taken my chances. I've done what I knew in my heart I needed to do. It's
Yeah.
an obligation I had to humanity. I've done it. If there's some consequences, so be it.
Well, it
Things
certainly
go.
takes courage, um, a lot of effort, a lot of courage, and I commend you highly for all that you're trying to do to help people through this, because it really, there are a lot of lessons in the book. Um, and I enjoyed reading it. And it really made me think. You gave me a lot to think about when I'm reading the book. It really
Well,
was. It was very interesting. And there's so much more to it than what we've discussed here. So I would recommend finding the book. Now, where can it be found? All the normal outlets, Vernon?
yeah, I mean, you can just go on Amazon and you know go to the book, Deceit the book
Mm-hmm.
on Amazon. So you can buy it. You get an ebook for I think it's $5.95, or a paperback, which Amazon will mail to you for $14.95, or there's an audio available on it as well.
Do you have a
17.
copy of the book with you to hold up at all?
Oh, I do. Yes. Here we go.
All right.
So
Well, that's
you,
great. And I wish I had when I downloaded it on my Kindle, so I'm unable to display it the way you are. Um, but yep, that's a copy of the book right there if you're watching. Deceit by Vernon Baumrind. And
I
Vernon,
might add,
again, yep,
sorry.
go, go
You
ahead.
can probably easy. The easiest thing to do would be to go to deceitthebook.com. Go to my website.
Deceitthebook.com.
Right. Go to that website. And on the first page of that website, I think it's 5 or 6 pages. The first page has got a red ribbon across it, about halfway down. Click on
Hmm.
that red, it'll take you directly to Amazon. Take you to the book on Amazon where you can order the book.
Oh, perfect. That's easy.
Right.
Deceitthebook.com. Yep, great. Um, well, Vernon, it's a pleasure talking with you. I could talk with you all morning long if we had the time, but I unfortunately we're starting to run out of time. Yep. Um, so again, deceitthebook.com, Vernon Baumrind. That's Baumrind. Vernon, anything we didn't get to speak about? I think we kind of covered all the
A lot of
necessary
things.
time.
Get yourself a copy of the book and read it through from beginning to end. Actually, I'm in the process of, I've actually just submitted a second edition to the book.
Oh,
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
yeah. There were some things that I didn't say that I regretted not having said. I've incorporated some new material in it. It's gone from, I think, 197 pages to 235.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, I'd
it's,
be interested. Let me know. Yeah.
it's even a little better written, I think.
It was well written, believe me. It was, kept me going. Kept me going. Well, all right, that sounds good. Well, thank you again, Vernon. And thanks everybody for listening. You remember, watch us, listen to us on healingvoicesproject.org. We are a nonprofit, and certainly if anybody would like to help us out to keep our program going, we appreciate it very much. Healingvoicesproject.org. Thanks everybody for listening, and thank you again, Vernon. I'm sure we'll be talking again soon. Appreciate
No
your
problem.
time.
Thank you very
Sure.
much.
All right.
Bye-bye.
See you, everybody.
Sure.
All right.